Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on practical tips to survive a cyber attack. My name's Abhi Rao, the Partner Relationship Manager here at BizCover, and I'd like to welcome our presenters and cyber experts, Grace Monaco, Senior Technical Claims Advisor at AIG, as well as Reese Corbett-Wilkins and Richard Birkin from the Incident Response Team at international law firm Clyde & Co. So today they'll be taking you through the current cyber risk landscape before moving on to an incident simulation based on the types of claims they see every day. And they'll also give you an overview of the AIG cyber liability policy and how it can help protect small businesses like yours. But before we get into it, we like to cross our T's and dot our I's. So we'll give everyone a moment to read over our disclaimer. We'll have that up on screen in a second. Also, feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions, and we'll endeavor to address them either during the webinar or contact you directly with a response after it's finished. So Grace, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Any business, big or small, holding personal information is at risk of a cyber attack. Today, we'd like to explain to you how the AIG cyber policy can help you survive a cyber attack. And we will go through a scenario based on real life examples and provide you with practical tips along the way as to what to do and what not to do, and highlighting the service and assistance you will get with the AIG policy. The main impact of a cyber breach to a small business will be your costs of having to deal with the incidents, the first party costs. We'll explain to you how the policy will deal with legal costs, IT forensic costs, cost to notify a data breach, and revenue losses if there are any. So today we have one of our main vendor partners with us today, Clyde & Co. They are an approved response advisor under our policy. And I'll pass over to Reese.
Thanks, Grace, and thank you, Abhi, and everybody for tuning in. Appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you all today to explain cyber risk. I just wanted to start to explain that cyber risk as a term, as a concept, means something different to everybody. If you're a parent with a child who's being cyber bullied, it means something very different to a very large organization whose customer details have been hacked. On the other side of the spectrum, small business owners who are frequently affected by cyber incidents, who can't turn on their computers affected by ransomware, will have a very different experience again. Law enforcement, who are responsible for arresting international crime syndicates, have a very different approach, as do governments, education, and obviously the legal sector as well. Today, we wanted to bring all of that together as a concept to give everybody a very practical example of what a cyber incident looks like. This incident is a very real example based on something that we've experienced and worked together with AIG on. And we're hoping that it can actually demystify what cyber risk actually means and provide you with some tangible experience of how to respond to a similar incident. Today, we're going to go through the scenario, and there's going to be various opportunities for you as the audience to actually make a decision to choose your own adventure as to how you would actually respond to the incident in real life. We've got questions on the right-hand side of the screen coming through. If we can, we'll address some of those along the way. Otherwise, we'll seek to address them at the end. Just set the landscape first for organisations such as yourselves.
Thanks, Reese. So just looking at the cyber risk landscape in general, in November 2017, the New South Wales Small Business Commissioner and its counterparts in the states and territories published the Cyber Aware amongst SME enterprises across Australia. So they surveyed over 1,000 SMEs, and 20% had experienced a cyber event in the 12 months prior. Of those that had experienced a cyber event, 41% were as a result of a malware, with other common causes being theft of business information and payment, invoice fraud, and online scams. They found out that it cost up to $5,000 just to get an organization back in a position to begin trading again. And for over 2/3, the costs associated with responding were unrecoverable. An interesting statistic that was also brought through in the report, they asked SMEs where they turn to when they get a security cybersecurity issue, and over 44% of respondents said they turned to Google for that information. In terms of what we're seeing, this generally, this accords with the types of incidents we're seeing. We're seeing a strong uptick on incidents affecting SMEs where unauthorized third parties get into their email accounts and attempt to commit online scams. We're also seeing an ever-present number of ransomware attacks affecting these organizations. So this is where essentially the computer systems for the whole organization are locked down and they can't do anything until they pay a ransom demand to the attackers.
Great, thanks Rich for the background explanation. From our observations, what's remarkably obvious for SME organisations is, although all types of organisations, whether they be government agencies or private sector organisations, big or small, across all industries, are at risk of being subject to a cyber attack, for small to medium enterprises in particular, it's quite a very significant operational risk. Whilst large organisations might be relatively able to withstand an attack, for small organisations it can be incredibly disruptive. It's incredibly important that SMEs get the right help at the right time to be able to get back to business as soon as possible. What we're going to do today is run through a case study, and this case study, as I said at the outset, has been designed on a similar incident that we've worked on, and we're hoping that everybody listening in today will be able to relate somewhat to this particular organisation. So the organisation today is Archie's Accountants. Archie's Accountants is an accounting firm based in Sydney. They have one office, about $600,000 in revenue, and 3 staff with about 5,000 clients. This is a fairly typical sized organisation, very good at what they do, but in terms of their organisational size, their clients and revenue, this is what we're seeing quite often. Archie's Accountants are very good at being an accountant, but aren't in the IT know, and so they outsource their IT solution to an organisation called Microcomputers. Again, this is fairly typical, where organisations outsource that expertise to a provider to manage their network. In terms of Archie's Accountants as an organisation, what they collect from an information perspective is obviously quite sensitive information, including tax file numbers, superannuation information, bank account details, etc. And that's both of their employees and also their clients. One of the misnomers that we often hear is smaller organisations assuming that they're not the target of cyber incidents. And there's a couple of points or observations that we have around that. The first is that all organisations, no matter what industry they operate in, collect information that is of some value to cyber criminals. And so in that respect, all organisations can be a target. The other point to bear in mind is that most attacks that we see are actually indiscriminate in the sense that if somebody clicks on a link or somebody downloads an attachment, their computers could be affected by a cyber incident. So quite often it's the case that organisations find themselves subject to it without being targeted. The takeaway point here is that this is a fairly standard size organisation that is subject to cyber risk. So if you put yourself in the seat of Archie, who runs Archie's Accountants, he wakes up in the morning, turns on his computer and opens up his emails. It's 10 a.m. this morning, so 2 hours ago, and Archie has received this email on his screen. You can see there that the email is from Armada Collective. Armada Collective is for those who haven't heard of them, they're a fairly well-known cybercrime organisation based out of Europe. This email has come into his mailbox at 10 a.m. this morning with the subject line, "Pay us now," and with an attachment there called customer files. You can see there that there is a ransom demand, a threat on the email, which effectively says that their files have been encrypted, and that means that they've been locked up and are unable to be accessed. There are some instructions at the bottom of the email about how the files can be recovered, and there's also a timer on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is a pretty typical ransom demand that we see. There's a couple of notable points there to point out. On the left-hand side, there's a timer, and you can obviously see in the email there that the threat actor has said that if you do not pay within a couple of days, then the ransom demand amounts will double. That's fairly standard approach that the criminal organisations take, and the reason is because they want to put the organisation in as much pressure as possible to effectively pay the ransom demand. These are financially motivated attacks. So you are Archie, and you've just received this email, and we have a couple of options as to what you might do in response. So we're just going to load up now a couple of options for you listen to choose as to how you might respond to having received this email. So you've got there a couple of options. If you could please select which option you would do. You would either open the attachment, reply to the email, delete or ignore it, call your IT provider, in this case it's Microcomputers. Curious to understand how many people would look to actually pay the ransom demand, or lastly call the police. So we might just let people choose as they go through. Great, we'll just leave that for about another 15 seconds. We can see some people coming in now. Yeah, so from our experience, I'm just seeing the results coming now. From our experience, most people would look to either delete or ignore this email. Some would actually look to open up the attachment. I'm just seeing the results now. About 60% of you have said that you would call your IT provider. Probably about 30% would say delete, ignore, and then about 10-15% saying call the police. That's really interesting. So half of you would call your IT provider. I think that's a pretty natural first start point. Some of you would delete or ignore the email. Of course, bearing in mind if this is a real attack, deleting or ignoring it means that you've missed the opportunity to respond to that 3-day window. Calling the police, we see people do that as well. The police, like any government organisation, are fairly limited in their resources. However, they are looking to actually increase their presence with responding to cybercrime. It's good to see that no one would pay, although that is an option which we will address in this scenario. Reply to threat actor, that's great as well. So people have not responded to the threat actor as well. So just coming back to the slides for a minute, that's a pretty typical response. Most people would call their IT provider. And so in this case, what did Archie actually do? Archie has done the right thing and he's called his IT provider, who has been able to look at this email and also look at the systems to see whether there's any legitimacy here. Is the threat real? Has there been an encryption or a ransomware attack? And the answer to that is yes. Archie's IT provider has been able to go through and has identified that a number of files have actually been encrypted. Now what that means is that Archie cannot cannot open or use those files. From a practical perspective, he's an accountant and so he's unable to actually review any of his clients' data, so he cannot actually complete any of his current workload. He's also unable to use the systems to enter into new data, which means he can't actually work on any new files. And from a compliance perspective as an accountant, he obviously can't actually access any of the historical data that he would need to be compliant as an accountant. The IT provider has put his hands up and said that he is very good at securing the network and helping him navigate most of your day-to-day IT issues, but he's not an expert in how to respond to this particular incident. What's made worse is that the actual backup system has also been affected as well, which means he can't restore from backup. And we'll go through that in a minute. Archie is stuck and he doesn't know where to turn because his IT provider doesn't know what to do next. So what does Archie do?
Okay, so there has been a ransomware attack and it's affecting the operation of Archie's business. Luckily, Archie is an ARG cyber policy holder and he has immediate access to the incident response services and expert advice. So what Archie should do is notify his broker and call one of the hotlines provided on the policy. So there are 2 hotlines on the policy, and what that does is it gives direct contact with an AIG call center representative who will take details about the company and the policy that you hold, and also the incident that has occurred, what has happened to date, and you will be transferred immediately to the response advisor law firm that you've selected. So in this case, Clyde & Co. So you get transferred by phone to Clyde & Co. Clyde & Co. are available 24/7 to assist with these type of cyber incidents, because as you can imagine, something like this can come through at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, or it can come through on the weekend if someone working remotely is the person who's identified it. So that access is available via the ARG policy. Clyde & Co. will arrange a triage call. Perhaps it'll be a call back in a couple of hours once you can get all the IT people on the line who know what's happened. What they will do is they will go through, take all the relevant factual information about the incident, find out how it was discovered, what's happened so far, and their role will be to investigate and help you contain and respond to the incident and give practical advice on the steps you need to take. At the same time, ARG Australia Claims team will be notified of your call to the hotline, and Clyde & Co. will be reporting back to me. So the real benefit of getting through to notifying us as soon as possible is, of course, access to the experts. You get the costs incurred within the first 72 hours are paid for directly by ARG without a retention applying. And the other very important benefit is that ARG are aware in real time what's going on, and we can help approve the steps, and there are no issues later about things having been done without our knowledge. So we're able to assist you in real time. The other thing that Clyde & Co. will do is they will consider whether or not an IT specialist needs to be brought in. Now, as we've seen, Archie's own IT provider does not have the experience to deal with a ransomware event. The cyber policy provides for costs of an IT specialist to basically provide advice on how to deal with this incident. So we have some approved providers, KPMG and IBM, and there are others that Clyde & Co. can bring in depending on the scale of the incident. And those people can be brought in coordinated by Clyde & Co., working with you, working with your existing IT, and everyone working together with ARG to make decisions about what has to happen next to contain the incident.
Wonderful. Thanks, Grace. That was really helpful. So practically speaking, when a cyber incident occurs, it's incredibly important that you are back to business as soon as possible. And that's always the focus of any incident, and how we can assist and ARG can assist with that. And we'll go through in a minute what that actually looks like in this particular scenario. So we know at the moment that Archie's system has been encrypted and he cannot access some of his data. That opens up a raft of options for how to respond. There are 5 options in front of you, and the 6th option we've said is not available, and that is restoring from backups. I just want to start with that option first. If an organization is impacted by ransomware and their data is affected, the best first course of action should always be to look to restore from backups. The difficulty is that sometimes we find that backups are also affected. And so it's a very good, I might just pull up the handbrake here and say, it's very good point to raise that you should speak to your IT provider to understand very clearly what data retention policy and program they have in place should this incident occur to you. How soon can they restore from backups if needed? How are the backups stored? Are they separate to where you essentially store your data so that they are not also infected? And what is the time and cost of restoring from backup? In short, if you can restore from backup, it's the easiest and quickest and cheapest way to respond from these kinds of incidents. Of course, though, in this incident, Archie's backups are also affected. So that means we need to investigate what else they can do. I'm going to go through these options now with you in a little bit of detail, and then everybody at home can decide how they would respond to it. In short, in looking at these menu, I guess, of options, you need to weigh up the time that each option would take to pursue, the costs involved, and also the prospects of each of those options successfully working. The first option there is to decrypt the data. Now, this option would require you to actually engage a separate provider who has expertise in decrypting and restoring data. The way that they do that is they will find known decryption keys based on similar kind of events and try to apply it so that they can actually crack your data and make it usable again. This option is sometimes expensive and isn't always a guaranteed success, although we have worked very well in the past with this option. The second option there is to liaise with what we call the threat actor, which is the bad guy, the person behind the threat. This option, generally speaking, is an option of last resort, and there's a number of risks associated with this option. Those risks include the fact that the threat actor themselves are a potentially criminal organization. There is no guarantee that they will provide the decryption key, even if you do pay for it. And sometimes they will give you a decryption key that will allow you to decrypt some of your data, but then continue to extort you for further funds. There's obviously moral and ethical questions, and some organizations turn to those considerations as well. And lastly, from a legal perspective, it's very, at this stage, unclear as to whether or not it is legal to pay, and the law enforcement here in Australia have stated very openly that they would not support organizations paying threat actors, although they recognize that some do. The third option is to see if there is an online key available online. There is a very good website, nomoreransom.org, which is a website run by law enforcement agencies around the world. And they are trying to provide decryption keys as they become available to the public at large to prevent them from having to engage with threat actors. The difficulty is that new ransomware variants come out every day, and it's very difficult to actually keep up with the bad guys. And so that option sometimes does not work either. The fourth option, and is actually one of the more difficult options for organizations, is to accept that their data is gone and actually take steps to recreate the data. Now, sometimes that might be possible. For example, Archie's accountants might have paper records of all of their transactions, and they could actually look to just simply restore their systems and input the data again. It's a time-consuming process and relatively costly as well. Option 5 there is to notify customers. Some people would look to notify customers. For example, Archie here is now faced with the prospects of not being able to use his systems, and he may need to actually look at notifying customers. So I just want to turn to the audience and give you the opportunity to determine out of those 5 options, which would you choose? So again, the first option is decrypt the data and pay a third-party provider to help with that. The second option is to liaise with the bad guy to try and get the decryption key and pay the funds. The third is to search online to see if there's an online key. The fourth is to do nothing, put your hands up and start again with recreating the data. And the fifth is to notify customers at this point. I might just give it about 15 or 20 seconds, but I can see some coming in already. Interesting. So we've got about half of the respondents have clicked through. It's a bit of an even race at the moment, actually. It's quite interesting seeing what the response is. I'll start with the bottom, actually. Most of you, or about 40% of you, are saying that you would notify your customers, which is actually quite interesting. We'll go into notifying customers throughout this example in a little more detail, but we would always say to pause on notifying customers until you actually know exactly what you can say, if at all. And we'll go through that in a bit more detail. There are other options, decrypt the data or see if there's an online key. That's great. And then the last 2 options, which people won't really opt for, is liaising with the threat actor and do nothing and recreate data. That all makes a lot of sense. That's pretty standard with what we see. And I think what's driving that possibly is that people are looking for what is morally correct and also what tends to work, which is that first option to look to decrypt the data. So what did Archie actually do in this situation? I'll hand over to Grace in a minute to understand how AIG can help with that decision-making process. But having consulted with Clyde & Co, having thought about it internally and having spoken to AIG, they've ultimately decided to go with the decryption of data option. I might just hand over to Grace to provide some comments around those options.
Thanks, Reece. So we've had matters with Clyde & Co where all of these options have been considered. The decryption of data option is one that works very well in a recent matter that we had together. As Reece said, all of the different options need to be weighed up. The decryption of data option is covered under the policy if it is, we have been involved in the cost, assessing the cost and assessing the reasonableness of those costs. If you have notified us and we have been involved in the process, we are making that decision with you in real time. So that's the real benefit. So we approved those costs, and the reason that was decided to be the best option in this case, in Archie's case, and in the real life case we recently had, was because there was a guarantee that within 3 days the data would be restored. It was a modest amount. It was an amount of money that was reasonable to pay, and that would have got the business back up and running. So obviously that was a good option for everyone and one that AIG approved and was able to deal with under the policy. The other options, I'll talk about the restore from backups. As Reece said, that's obviously the easiest option. We've had numerous matters where that's been able to be achieved. The cost of your own IT provider storing from backups is covered under the policy, and that's obviously the nicest, cleanest way to go forward. But unfortunately, these ransomware incidents are becoming more and more sophisticated, and often the backups are also encrypted. The issue of liaising with the threat actor is one that does come up, and it has come up in some cases. As Reece said, it really is an option of last resort. In certain circumstances, we will consider, with advice from the lawyers, with advice from IT professionals, whether that really is the only option. And there is the possibility of that being covered with our consultation and with the lawyer's advice.
Thanks, Grace. That's really helpful to understand. And we've emphasised it a few times in this presentation, but it really is about helping you make this decision in real time. You've got the benefit of AIG looking at it from a policy perspective. You've got the benefit of us helping from a legal perspective, but also having dealt with quite a large number of these incidents. And obviously, the last point, which we touched on earlier, is sitting behind the policy, AIG's policy, is a number of providers, IT forensic specialty providers that can also assist, and that includes KPMG, IBM, and others. In this case, the focus has been on getting Archie back to business and getting their data restored. There is another aspect to this incident, though, that we need to look at. So just coming back to the scenario, what did Archie do? So in this case, they've restored the data. Their IT provider has taken the data off the other organization who has decrypted it. They've secured their networks. They've restored the data back onto the network, and Archie's operational again. Often at that point, if not beforehand, we would work with third-party providers such as KPMG and IBM just to have a look at it and ensure that that whole process occurs in a secure way, because the biggest risk is ensuring that this incident doesn't happen again. And so it's always good to get the benefit of experience from security professionals to provide Archie and their IT provider with things that they can do to ensure this doesn't happen again from a security perspective. Also, where this goes to next is the secondary focus of all of this incident is to look at whether or not there are any privacy implications of this incident. And typically we would work very closely with an organization, their IT provider, or someone like KPMG and IBM to work through the implications of that. I'm going to hand over to Richard now, who's going to walk through a little bit around the privacy laws and around the implications for this incident.
Thanks very much, Reece. So just, I guess, to circle back around, like Reece said, Archie's been able to get back to business. The ransomware incident's been contained. We then assist with putting on our investigation hat to explore whether you have any privacy obligations in connection with the incident. So on 22nd of February this year, a new mandatory reporting regime came into force for organizations who experience a data breach. For any organization considering this, we get asked two questions. First, what does the Privacy Act even apply to me in the first place? And then second, if it does, do we need to notify or do we need to do anything? So as a general rule of thumb, the Privacy Act applies to Commonwealth government agencies and private sector organizations with an annual turnover of 3 million or more. This is a bit of it's a common myth that this is a blanket rule. Some organizations that turn over less than $3 million are not caught. So there are a number of exceptions to this rule, including if you are a health service provider, if you're a small business that contracts with the Commonwealth government, if you collect and hold tax file numbers, which that might catch Archie in this case, or if you operate a residential tenancy database. You also have to consider, even if you're not subject to the Privacy Act and it doesn't apply, there's a general expectation we find between the public and your customers that you should notify, irrespective of whether you have an obligation under the Privacy Act to do that. So organizations may need to consider whether they ought to investigate and notify in any event. Just last week, we assisted a small real estate practice to notify customers as a matter of courtesy, even though they didn't technically have to under the Privacy Act. They were really keen to be open and transparent with their customers and clients. So if we've established that it might apply, or we might want to notify our clients in any event, second, we need to conduct an investigation into the incident. So unless we know that a data breach has occurred for sure, we need to investigate to determine whether it is one or not. We have 30 days to conduct that investigation, and then after that 30-day time frame, we need to form a view whether an eligible data breach under the Privacy Act has taken place. We then have to notify our customers as soon as we can following the completion of that assessment. Who to notify? If we are required to under the Privacy Act, we need to notify the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner and those affected individuals and clients that are at risk of harm, and this is a legal test under the Act. So just turning to what the investigation would usually look like, we ask 3 key questions. So each question here presents an opportunity to have to not notify if the circumstances of the incident allow it. So that first question is, has there been a data breach? And this is where it's really important that IT forensics are involved and they can answer that question for us. So the question is, has there been unauthorized access to or disclosure or loss of personal information as a result of the incident? And that's something that our IT forensic partners will weigh in on. If they can establish that that personal information has not been accessed, then we don't need to notify. But if they do, then we need to move on to the second question. Now, the second question is serious harm likely? This is a legal test, and it takes into consideration 20 plus factors, but it can be broadly categorized as looking at the type and sensitivity of the personal information involved. Say, is this health information, or is it relatively benign contact information, or is it, for example, details of criminal convictions? We then look at the circumstances of the breach. So is this a case where you have inadvertently sent an email to a close friend, or is this a case where somebody, like with Archie, has been in Archie's system without authority? And then lastly, we look to the nature of harm that could flow if that personal information that has been accessed is misused. Now, people often jump to, only thinking that financial harm can flow from, say, misuse of financial information or internet scams, but this also extends to emotional and reputational harm. So that's the broad test that you need to conduct. And like I said, it's really a grab bag of 20 different factors that we have to step through depending on the particular circumstances of the incident. We recently helped a small catering company and determined that serious harm wasn't likely because the personal information involved was purely corporate contact information for clients who were making catering orders. So the last question here is, can remedial action be taken to prevent that risk of harm if we've assessed that there's been unauthorized access, that we might have serious harm? There's usually little that can be done at this stage, but I mentioned before an example where maybe we've inadvertently sent an email to, say, a friend or somebody else. We can take steps to recall that and get the person who received it to confirm that they didn't access the information or misuse it. So coming back to Archie's case, in this case, we have a question around unauthorized access to their system. They hold tax file numbers. It's been shown that serious harm could potentially flow from misuse of tax file numbers. So just think around tax return season. So do we have to notify employees, clients, or customers as a result of that?
Great, thanks, Rich. As everybody would have gathered listening in on that, is that there is quite a bit of detail to work through in actually forming a view as to whether or not you need to notify individuals of an incident. And I just want to touch on that before we actually discuss what Archie did. The Privacy Commissioner's very clear position is that organisations need to treat potential data breaches very seriously and actually take the time to step through these details. Just because there's been a potential data breach does not necessarily mean you need to notify the Privacy Commissioner or potentially affected individuals. In fact, it's the opposite. The Privacy Commissioner does not want every incident to be notified. The Privacy Commissioner is trying to avoid, in that scenario, people being notified of all sorts of incidents. And what that would lead to is notification fatigue. And that's where effectively people receive notifications, but then switch off and don't do anything about it. The point of notification is mitigation. And what we mean by that is, if your organization has had a data breach and there is a risk of harm to individuals whose personal information is at risk, then you do need to notify them so that you can put those individuals on notice that an incident has occurred and to let them know what steps they need to take to prevent any potential misuse of their information. And that could be as simple as, for example, changing passwords to their email account if that was the subject of the incident, or it could be as simple as monitoring their financial statements for any misuse. There's obviously other examples as well, but that's the point, is to put the individual on notice of an incident so they can take steps. So what did Archie do in this case? Archie formed the view that there was an eligible data breach and that they did have to notify. They notified their clients whose tax file number details and bank account and superannuation details are on file. They notified their employees whose personal information was on file, as well as any employees you can imagine personal information will be on file, as well as the OIC, the Privacy Commissioner themselves. Now, very practically, Archie can do that in a number of different ways. The very nice thing about the Australian regime, unlike the US, is that you don't have to send it by letter. You can send a notification by whatever the ordinary means is through which you communicate with your stakeholders, and if that's email or letter or call or face-to-face, whatever it might be, or on your website. So Archie has sent that out, and they've also notified the OIC. Typically what would happen is the OIC would ask follow-up questions and look to understand that Archie has identified what the root cause is of this incident and closed off that root cause so that there's no continued unauthorized access to the systems. The OIC would be looking to understand that Archie has actually addressed some of the underlying privacy issues, and that might include, for example, not securely storing the information on their systems. And they also look to understand that Archie has then notified everybody at risk of harm before they can then close it off. There are other powers that the OIC has, but in the current landscape, the OIC is looking to work collaboratively with organizations to ensure that they learn from the incidents and to prevent them from happening again. So that wraps up the incident, but what I might do is just hand over to Grace just to kind of sum it all up from an insurance perspective, to sum this up from an insurance perspective, to put it in practical terms for everybody on the call. You've just gone through this incident. It's taken a couple of weeks. It's been very stressful, but you've got through it in the end. You've managed to restore your data and get back to business. You managed to notify individuals and conduct an investigation, but then ultimately notify them of the incident. And you've also notified the OIC, and you can now see the back of it. So Grace, are you able to walk us through the insurance implications and how that washes through?
So on the next slide, you'll see the costs associated with Archie's incident. And this is obviously the most important point for Archie to understand. What has this all cost and how does the AIG policy help? So Archie has had the benefit of Clyde & Co.'s legal services throughout the incident. They contacted Clyde & Co. at the outset, so they've had both the costs of dealing with the coordination and remediation of the incident, and also the cost of getting the privacy advice, which they needed to understand whether or not they had to notify individuals. Clyde & Co. would have provided an advice in writing that Archie can rely on. Clyde & Co. would also help actually draft the notifications that need to go to the customers. So there's the Clyde & Co. costs, which would of course be covered under the policy. There would also be Archie's, so there would also be KPMG costs, or whoever the approved forensic advisor is. Those costs would be both the initial investigation and advice on recovering from the ransomware, and also the deeper dive into the root cause of the incident and whether or not substantiating whether or not there has been a breach of data. So those costs are covered under the policy, and you need that work to understand whether or not there's been a breach of data and whether or not you need to notify. Archie's own local IT provider will have done work also in consultation with the advice provided from from the IT specialist and from Clyde & Co. So we will look at those invoices and look at the response work that they have done. They would do the actual work of restoring the software and getting your system back up and running. They're the people who know the systems. They're the ones who would be doing that in consultation with the advice that's been given. The data restoration costs as well, as we said, in this situation, it was determined that that was the quickest, easiest and safest way to get the data back and to restore Archie to operation. So that cost is also covered. And then the notification costs are really wrapped up in the legal costs of the advice and the notification regime. So that's the costs, the first party costs of this incident that you'd get the benefit of cover under the ARG policy. In the next slide, I just want to talk briefly also about business interruption. So we offer a business interruption extension to the cyber policy. So once you've got your backup and running and all of those issues have been dealt with, if there has been a material disruption, meaning your business could not operate solely as a result of this breach that occurred, and you've incurred additional operating costs, or you've been able to demonstrate an actual loss of net profit, you will then make a claim under the business interruption extension of the policy. So we deal with that claim after we've dealt with actually getting you back up and running and dealing with those costs. So that claim is subject to a 24-hour wait period, which means the first 24 hours any loss is part of your retention. Basically, that's the excess. After that, there's an indemnity period of up to 120 days. So loss sustained within that 120 days. You'll need to provide a submission to ARG on what your loss is and how it's calculated and provide supporting documents. So, for example, if the interruption meant that a client requiring urgent work was lost, we'll need documentary evidence of this, for example, the correspondence from that client and evidence of what the revenue would have been. So you've lost that client, you need to demonstrate to us that you've lost that client because of this incident and what the revenue would have been within that 120 days. Another example would be that you've had to call in extra staff, casual staff, or subcontract work out to another provider. And we'll need, of course, also documentary evidence of that so that we can understand the time and cost involved. If you consider there's been a loss of actual profit, we'll need relevant financial data to show that. So, for example, it'll be different in each case, but for example, proof of your usual net income for probably the year prior and the few months after the interruption, and details of your actual net income during the period of interruption so that we can understand the loss. So, an important thing to remember is that paying your usual staff during the period of interruption and those staff suffering a lack of productivity because systems are down is not of itself a loss. There needs to be a loss of net profit, which needs to be demonstrated on the documents. So ARG will work with you, will generally instruct a forensic accountant, loss adjuster, to assist us to quantify the loss and to ask you the right questions to ensure that, that you can provide information to us to assess.
Thank you, Grace. That's really helpful in summing all that up and bringing it together from a cost perspective. I think one observation that we have is that while these are fairly insurance terms, business interruption, etc., ultimately from a client's perspective, where their biggest risk is financially for these incidents is reputational harm. And that is because in today's digital world, we expect as a society that organizations keep data secure, and there's a number of headline incidents that we're all familiar with over the last year or two around the world. Businesses these days more and more, because the public expectation is that they keep data secure, they now are starting to look at choosing providers based on whether that data is kept secure. And so for Archie's accountant, he may lose customers as a result of this, who may go to the shop down the road. We don't know, but we have seen that before in other incidents as well. So things just to bear in mind that ultimately it's your customers' well-being and the security of their data that you need to have in mind, and what the flow-on effect is to your business should you have an incident. What we wanted to do now is just go through some really practical takeaway tips that everyone on the call can think about what they might wish to do following this to start to address what we call cyber risk on a preventative basis. So I might just hand over to Rich just to walk through some of those points on the screen.
Yeah, so in the first instance, we'd always recommend that you review your insurance requirements and particularly whether cyber insurance would be right for you given the context of what we've discussed today in the presentation. There's also some other practical tips here to review your IT systems and security procedures, and this is something that your outsourced IT provider can help you with if you don't have an internal IT person. Develop an effective incident response plan, so know what to do when that incident hits, and we would hope that it wasn't jump straight on to Google. So I mean, a benefit of having the policy behind you is that you get that hotline service. So if you do nothing, then getting a cyber insurance policy that has access to that hotline in time of need is really the important first step. Also, you can go through various scenario testings, just to understand what types of incidents your business could impact. And again, this is something that your IT provider can assist with, and develop and implement employee awareness training. That we find often in our experience, employees are the biggest weakness to letting incidents in through the door. Consider and review the contracts that you have in place with your IT vendor and any third-party data processors. So what that means is make sure you understand who holds your data and what to do in the event of an incident. And also it'd be helpful to have data mapping and audit processes. So kind of breaking this down, in the first instance, understand what types of personal information you hold, where you hold it, who holds it if you have an IT provider that holds the data on your behalf, and just understand what you need to do in the event of an incident and how it might impact your customers.
Thanks, Rich. And if I can just add one other point, there is to continually talk to your employees around these types of incidents. I know there's a point there about awareness training. It's as simple as on a weekly or monthly basis, just sit down and talk to your employees about this, because ultimately technical and security controls only go so far. Your employees are really your last line of defense. When you look at the statistics coming through the OAIC, and they report on this quarterly, about half of the incidents that are reported, the root cause is actually human error. And by that we mean somebody's clicked on a link, somebody's downloaded an attachment, somebody has put in their username and password onto a website, somebody has picked up a USB at a conference and plugged it in the computer when they go back to work. There's a whole bunch of ways in which this happens, but really we see employee awareness as probably being the key standout and an easier to address point there. The other point I just wanted to mention is that incident response scenario testing, realistically, organizations, and we fully appreciate that SME organizations only have so much time in the day, and that's absolutely understandable. A very easy way to address this is just to rehearse for at least 1 hour or so about how you might respond. Who do you call first? What level of serviceability does your IT provider have? Do they respond to you within 3 hours, 5 hours, 1 day? Just really understanding what that looks like, so that you can understand, do you call your broker, do you call AIG directly, whoever it might be. And we would just say speak to your broker or BizCover around that to be very clear as to what to do next. So we now have about 10 minutes left, and we just wanted to see if there are any questions at all. So feel free to please put them in the chat on the right-hand side. So one of the questions somebody has asked is, it says, my client has lost $80,000 by a false order by email. Is this considered a cyber attack, and can insurance cover this risk? I might just hand over to Grace to respond from an insurance perspective, but just wanted to say that this is a very common type of incident that we're seeing. Today we chose ransomware as a scenario to give you an example, but this is a type of incident we see often. So I'll just hand over to Grace.
Thanks, Reece. It's a good question. So our cyber policy, the focus of the cyber policy is to investigate a data breach, so loss of personal information, which you have a legal obligation to keep safe. So it's investigating a data breach and investigating and remediating a computer security incident where there's been an intrusion to your computer system. as a result of, for example, a malware, a hacking, a ransomware where all your data has been encrypted and you cannot operate. It's, as we've discussed today, the costs of dealing with that, including the investigation of that and making recommendations to you how to remedy the issue. The loss of funds via an email that was a false email that you relied on, that's not something that would be looked at under the cyber policy. That would be, we have other products that deal with that. Crime policy looks at the direct financial loss, it's called, where you have mistakenly paid money because of fraud in that way.
Great, thanks, Grace. There's a couple of other questions that have come through. I should just say, if there's any other further questions, please email marketing@bizcover.com.au and we will look to address them after this seminar. Another question that has come through is, for insurance purposes, how do you quantify reputational damage which impacts on the bottom line beyond 120 days?
Again, a very good question. So as Reece said, the reputational damage is one of the biggest risks to your organisation. And the way we look to mitigate that is by having good incident response services available for you to access immediately to help you get on top of a breach as soon as possible and to obtain advice on how you can basically salvage your reputation through the process. One area we didn't talk about is PR cover. There is also under the policy the possibility of PR costs cover. Depends on the size and scale of the incident, of course, and whether you need that type of assistance, but there's a possibility of bringing in a PR specialist to give you some advice during the incident as well. In terms of quantifying that loss, as I said, in terms of the business interruption cover, there needs to be an actual quantified loss of profits for that specific cover to come into place.
Great, thanks, Grace. We just had another question come through. It's a very good question as well. If you're an e-commerce business using suppliers such as Shopify or MailChimp, which is an email service provider, and their systems were compromised and therefore affected your customers, would insurance apply? Before we look to answering that, I just wanted to say that from your perspective as an organization, you should look to understand which organizations you work with and how you rely on those organizations to hold and manage your data. It's very often, in fact, more often than not, that a breach actually arises on the other side of the fence, not on your systems, but on the systems of your suppliers and your contractors who you work with. So it's very good from the outset, from a risk management perspective, to actually understand what are your contractual terms, and if there was an incident to arise, how that would be managed with those providers. So I think we're coming up to the end of the seminar. Unless anybody has any other questions, we might give it about 30 seconds. So while we're just waiting for a few more questions to come through, as a helpful takeaway point, can I encourage everybody listening in, there are a couple of really good websites and that you can subscribe to just to keep updated around what's happening in the threat landscape and the cyber world. There's some good government organization websites, ScamWatch, the ACCC has quite a number of resources that you can look at, ID Care as well. So I'd encourage everybody to look at that as well. Great. I think because we're coming to the end of the seminar, there's a few more questions that have come through. What we might do is we might take all those and respond to those people individually. But I just wanted to thank everybody from Cloudico's perspective for taking the time to come here today as well. Wonderful. Okay, everybody, thank you for joining today. That comes to the end of the seminar, and feel free to send through